Hi, I'm Kristen Bird. Really happy to be here today. I'm going to be giving a talk on impacts to and opportunities for providing rangeland ecosystem services under climate and land use change. And I want to acknowledge my many co-authors I've been working with over the years, especially Lori Flint and Alan Flint, because of the hydrology models that they've been running. They really made this work possible. So what are ecosystem services? Services are basically just the benefits that humans derive from nature. And rangelands across the state are known to provide many different kinds of ecosystem services. They fall in different categories. You have provisioning services. These are the products that are produced through our ecosystems that humans need to survive, like food and fiber. Regulating services. These are the way ecosystems can maintain the natural cycles, like the carbon cycle or the water cycle that are needed to sustain life. We have cultural services. Rangelands provide recreation, educational opportunities, aesthetic values, which are really important. And supporting services, which are the components of the ecosystems that allow the other kinds of services to exist. So there's a few different ecosystem services that I've worked on primarily in my work, and I'll be talking about those today. One of them being habitat. And as you know, rangelands in California cover a vast land area. About half of the state are considered rangeland ecosystem types. And so because of that, they can support many different kinds of fish and wildlife populations, as well as many different kinds of threatened and endangered species. And these lead to a number of different kinds of benefits that we derive, including wildlife observation, recreation, hunting, fishing. And because of this large land area that rangelands encompass, underneath that land area is a vast soil carbon pool. And so rangelands provide an important ecosystem service of soil carbon storage and carbon sequestration. And maintaining this soil carbon pool and encouraging soil carbon sequestration can be an important role in reducing the impacts of climate change. Also, rangelands provide a very important role in supplying fresh water. Chris Hafstad, a rangeland ecologist, wrote in a paper a while back, the ecosystem service that most directly links growing human populations to rangelands is water supply. And so I'm going to be focusing mostly on this particular ecosystem service for my talk. And for example, rangelands are very important for groundwater recharge, which of course is important for providing our supply that we need for human use. So as you probably know, rangelands in California are really subject to land conversion. There have been ongoing trends of conversion of rangeland to other land uses over the past several decades. In general, in California, about 20,000 acres of rangeland are lost every year. One reason for this is the fact that there are lower levels of land protection on rangelands. A lot of them are privately owned. And they tend to be converted to either urban or suburban land uses or other higher value crops like orchards or vineyards. The other thing that rangelands are facing, as Jeremy mentioned, is our changing climate. And as he pointed out in the original graphs, we are already experiencing a change in climate over the past several years. The years 2014, 15, 16, and 17 were actually the highest recorded on record. And rainfall has also dropped off, and we're seeing a drying climate, trends of a drying climate, where the past 7 years out of 10 have been lower than average compared to our historical climate average. So there are a few different climate models that have been run for California, and they give a couple of different stories of what the future of California's climate might be. There's some agreement in them and some areas where they don't agree. One area where they definitely agree is the fact that our temperatures will likely increase. All the models seem to converge to say that temperatures will increase into the future. The thing that don't quite agree on so much is how much rainfall we're going to get. Some of them say we're going to be overall becoming more dry. Some of them say we'll be becoming overall more of a wet climate. But considering that, there's a couple things that there's some sort of commonalities in the models. One, that the water availability is going to become pretty uncertain. We won't really know how much we're going to get. While we might have more rainfall overall, we're probably going to be having longer periods of drought and interspersed with these more extreme rainfall events. And then we'll probably have earlier snow melt, so we'll have a longer sort of a summer drying season to deal with. So we had a project that we worked on a few years ago. It was published a couple years ago in Landscape Ecology on integrated climate and land use change scenarios for California rangeland ecosystem services. And we looked across a large area of California at 3 main ecosystem services: wildlife habitat, soil carbon, and water supply. And we wanted to understand how they might be changing or be impacted by future changes to our land use in California and to climate, and the two of those interacting together. So we used a couple of different models to run projections of land use change as well as climate change, and then looked at the potential impacts on a spatially explicit basis, looking at map data. So for this study, we really focused on the California Rangeland Coalition focus area, which encompasses the entire Central Valley and the surrounding foothills, both the Sierra foothills and the Coast Range. And this area was mapped by the Nature Conservancy, and they also included areas called priority habitats, which were areas of high conservation value that needed protection. We studied ecosystem services across the whole focus area, but then also along 6 case study watersheds surrounding, kind of dispersed throughout. So in this area, we looked at a lot of different rangeland habitat types and land uses as they were mapped in the USGS National Land Cover Data Set. They're pretty general land cover classes, but in general, we looked at the kinds of habitats you would consider as rangeland: forest, which in this case would be the oak woodlands, grassland, some wetlands, and shrubland. And then we looked at some of the land uses that were creating pressure on these habitats, mainly developed lands, urban and suburban, as well as irrigated agriculture, and that's sort of a lumped class of cropland as well as orchards and vineyards. And just want to note, in order to do our work, one of the tools we relied on heavily was the basin characterization model. So this is the hydrology water balance model that was developed by Lori and Alan Flint, and they've run it for the state. So what they can do is they can take information or data on temperature and precipitation and projections of those based on climate models, and then model changes in hydrological variables like groundwater recharge, stream runoff, evapotranspiration, climatic water deficit, and it's a grid-based model. So it produces a map output with the grids of a scale of 270 meters. So they can do that for the whole state. So for our study, the first thing we did is really just sort of establish some baseline. What are the ecosystem services? How do we quantify them for the Rangeland Coalition focus area? And we did this for the focus area and also for those 6 watersheds. But just want to highlight a few numbers here. We looked at grassland habitat. It's about 8.5 million acres. And within that grassland habitat, looking at the soils in that habitat down 20 centimeters, we have about 100 teragrams of soil organic carbon in that land area. So to kind of give you some perspective on that, if you take that 100 teragrams of soil organic carbon and convert it to greenhouse gas equivalents, that's equivalent to the emissions from 94 coal-fired power plants in 1 year. So it's hard to imagine, but it's a vast carbon pool. Using the BCM, we're also able to quantify the amount of in-place groundwater recharge that occurs on all of these lands, as well as the surface runoff that occurs on these lands on an annual basis. And it's quite a bit of water moving through the system. We have about 15.5 million acre feet per year on average. So again, to put that into perspective, annually, the urban and industrial uses of water in California equal about 9 million acre feet. So I just want to give some highlights about from our study, focusing first on wildlife habitat and carbon. So again, we ran these spatially explicit land use change models to look at how the different rangeland habitats might be impacted by development and changes in irrigated agriculture. And this plot shows for the whole focus area, for a, sort of a high growth scenario, how the different land covers might change from one decade starting in the beginning, 2010, to the end of our model run, which is the 2100, so end of century. So this dark yellow here is grassland area. The black is developed, and the light yellow is the irrigated agriculture. So you can see that grassland area does decrease a fair amount over the 100 years. Developed area also increases as well. And the irrigated actually across the whole area stays somewhat constant, but it's actually shifting locations. It's being displaced by development and moving into areas of grassland where agriculture wasn't present. We had a couple different scenarios, but overall, we showed that within 100 years, there may be a risk of losing about a third of our grassland area to land use change. And then considering the soil carbon pools that are existing in that habitat, again, about a third of the soil carbon pool of the Rangeland Coalition focus area might be disturbed as a result of that land conversion. And some studies show that if you disturb these soil pools, about a third of that carbon might be released as emissions. Looking at some land use change patterns at our 6 different watersheds, we have 3 watersheds that were really impacted more by development. Alameda Creek, Casumnes watershed, and the Lower Butte watershed, where grassland was being lost more to development. And then other watersheds, Estrella, Upper Stony, and Upper Tule, where you had more of a change in the intensive agriculture that was affecting the grasslands. But overall, the main findings was that of all the different kinds of habitat of rangelands that you find, it was the grasslands that are experiencing the greatest, could be experiencing the greatest amount of loss. This was at all scales, both at the focus area scale and at the watershed scale. We see sort of a shift in the croplands moving upwind into the foothills. Grassland conversion rates can be fairly high, especially in some of these areas that have been mapped as priority habitat areas. The grasslands do contain a significant soil carbon pool, and those are at risk from the land conversion as well. So just to kind of give a summary then of the water supply component of our project. One of the things that this hydrology model can do is model change in climatic water deficit. And this is becoming a really important variable in understanding plant water stress and how it might change with a changing and drying climate. So climatic water deficit is the potential evapotranspiration minus actual evapotranspiration. So it's like, how much water could the plant transpire if it was had all the water it needed, minus how much water is actually transpiring based on the water that's available. So it's a good indicator of plant water stress. And we ran a couple of different climate models showing different levels of projections and temperature increases for the state. And overall, we saw the same trends, whether you have a low level of temperature increase or a high amount of temperature increase. You have an increase in the climatic water deficit across the state, just across the board, just at varying levels. So, you would have a greater amount of climatic water, greater amount of climatic water deficit with higher temperature increases, less of a deficit with lower temperature increases, but no matter what, you're going to see increased plant water stress into the future. And this is really across the board. And in all of our areas. Another part of the study was to understand the effects of a drying climate on groundwater recharge as an ecosystem service. And so for these plots, I just want to focus on the left side here. So the x-axis is rainfall from low to high, from 300 millimeters to 900. And then the y-axis is showing how much recharge is occurring or how much runoff is occurring based on the level of rainfall. And we're looking at a couple of case study watersheds here, Alameda Creek and Casumnes, which are both impacted by future development. If you look at the watersheds without considering future land use change as sort of baseline, kind of makes sense. With more rainfall, you can have more groundwater recharge, more runoff. And it's interesting, some of these watersheds like Casumnes, just because of their geology and their soils, they can be considered groundwater recharge dominant as opposed to runoff dominant, meaning most of the water that falls on that watershed gets delivered as groundwater recharge instead of runoff. Alameda Creek in wetter times is kind of more runoff dominated, but as you have more of a drying period, actually slightly more of that rainfall is delivered as groundwater recharge. Now if you throw urbanization into the mix with the changing climate, you can see shifts in the sort of the hydrology patterns in the watersheds. So with increasing impervious surface and development, both watersheds flip from being groundwater dominated to runoff dominated. So most of that rainfall is then being delivered as surface runoff as opposed to groundwater recharge. So just to sort of summarize the results from our water supply study, we're likely to have a highly variable future climate with longer droughts and more extreme events. No matter the climate scenario, we're likely to have increases in climatic water deficit across the state. And these increases could go up to 30%. In a drier climate, as rainfall drops off, we'll have more water delivered as groundwater recharge as opposed to surface runoff. But when we increase urban development on rangelands, combined with periods of drought, this reduces the opportunity for groundwater recharge, especially in areas where we have deep soils. So we really emphasize, our results really emphasize the role of open rangeland in capturing water and reducing runoff and increasing groundwater recharge. So given sort of these projections of increased landscape stress in rangelands, climatic water deficit, reduced groundwater recharge, we have had a new study that was just finished that addressed the question, how do we enhance climate resiliency on rangelands? Work by Wendy Silver's group has shown that increasing rangeland soil organic matter, like for example adding compost to your soils, has had many benefits, like improving soil health, forage and crop yields. It can sequester carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it increases soil water holding capacity, which can reduce the landscape demand for water. So I just want to talk briefly about a study that was published back in August. It was led by Lori Flint. This was for the California's Fourth Climate Change Assessment. And the question that was addressed in this report was, if all the soils in California working land, so that's all the rangelands as well as the croplands, are managed to increase soil organic matter in some way through some kind of management practice, and that it leads to increased soil water holding capacity, what are the hydrology and the climate resiliency benefits? How do our hydrology variables change as a result? So yeah, so this was considering all of these lands here in green and yellow and orange. So sort of a summary of what happens when you increase soil water holding capacity and some of the hydrology benefits that you're likely to achieve. For one, it increases evapotranspiration of your vegetation, of your forage, so it can then increase net primary productivity. And it can also allow a forage to become sustained productivity in drier years. You can get more groundwater recharge relative to runoff, and we can reduce our climatic water deficit. So again, they use the basin characterization model to do all this work for the state. So they ran the basin characterization model for the whole state and assumed that we could increase the soil organic matter by 3%, sort of across the board. So it's a simulation, just see what happens. And then they added up all the hydrology benefits that might occur. So they added up the amount of reduced climatic water deficit, the increased ET, as well as the increased groundwater recharge. And so kind of produced this composite map. And so what it shows that all across all the working lands, there's no area where you're going to have no benefit whatsoever in your hydrology changes. There are areas that are, have greater benefits than others. So places like in the valley bottom, not as much benefit as areas where you have higher precipitation, like in the Sierra foothills and in the Coast Range areas. So that's sort of an ideal case, just looking at all the lands across the board. My part of the study was to come in and ask the question, given the fact that rangelands are experiencing land conversion, where does land conversion of these lands limit the opportunity for gaining these hydrology benefits derived from managing soils, because we're losing the opportunity to do the work if it's converted to another use. Also, we're interested in the question, given climate change and other kinds of stressors, preservation alone or land conservation alone might not sustain the ecosystem services that we're hoping to achieve or protect. So what do we do about that? So what we did next is to ask the question, to what extent and where, if we teamed soil management practice with conservation, how can we enhance the ecosystem services that conservation programs were designed to protect? And just to run through this kind of quickly, the first thing we did is to look at where development is likely to occur and how that might limit our opportunity or lose our potential for gaining hydrology benefits from managing the soils on these agricultural lands. And where are those lost potential benefits greater? So there were, based on our land use change projections of development, there are a few counties that kind of stuck out as areas where you have sort of the greatest risk of lost opportunities for land conservation and land management. And as you can imagine, there are areas that are, have a lot of growth. So those are Sacramento County, Riverside, San Diego, and Santa Clara, where there's a lot of development going on. We found that Shasta and Santa Clara counties were areas where there was a lot of development, and also because of the soils and geologies, a lot of potential for it, really increased hydrology benefits from soil management. So there's sort of an intersection there. We looked at a couple of different conservation programs to see how soil management on conservation lands might allow us to enhance our hydrology ecosystem services. One program that we looked at was the Williamson Act land. So this is sort of an idealized scenario, but the question was, if we were to implement soil management practices in all of Williamson Act lands across the state, what would be the hydrology benefits? And again, Williamson Act lands are lands held in contract for 10 years with a promise to prevent development in exchange for reduced taxes. And given the vast amount of land that are held in Williamson Act contracts, there's a lot of opportunity for enhanced water benefits on these lands. But we also want to look at where the benefits might be higher. Overall, if we have a wetter climate scenario, we might potentially have an increase of 700,000 acre-feet annually statewide if all lands were managed to increase soil carbon. In a dry climate scenario, that would be reduced to about half, maybe about 400,000 acre-feet. What kind of stood out was Tehama County as an outlier, where it had the greatest potential for water benefits, partly because of the soils and the climate, but also because of the large land area held in contract. So just sort of summarize our take-home messages. Most of our scenarios show that the dry season is going to be extended out into the summer, and so water storage is going to be necessary, either above or below ground. So we could consider climate-smart land use planning as a way to recognize the role of rangelands in maintaining recharge areas that can help conserve our water supplies in dry years. But even with land conservation, we have less reliable precipitation, so that can limit the provision of the ecosystem services that these lands are meant to provide. So nearly all rangelands have been found to have potential to benefit from strategic soil management. And very few locations don't benefit because of soil texture or low rainfall. But if we can increase soil organic matter, we can show that we can show increases in soil water holding capacity, evapotranspiration, groundwater recharge, and reduced climatic water deficit. Increasing organic matter can also lead to increased crop and forage production, but we do need to consider that the gains in ecosystem services will vary by location, the agricultural practice and the adoption rate, and the type of land uses that we're considering. So with that, I just want to acknowledge our funders, and thanks very much.
Does anyone have a question or two for Kristen as we get our next speaker set up?
Yeah?
You said that, I believe you said that when an acre of rangeland, for example, is converted, that about half of its soil carbon pool is lost, or excuse me, a third of its soil carbon pool is lost. And I was curious, is that different if it's converted to intensive agriculture as opposed to development? And have those losses been measured or just modeled?
Yeah, that number is kind of rough, and at this point, I just have those numbers based on studies from other areas, so I can't say they're really California specific. So I don't really have a solid number on that, but just based on the literature, it's kind of what it's showing. It might be a third. Yeah.
So, a number of my foothill ranchers have had questions about compost application, and I'm very curious as to whether there are long-term benefits to that primary productivity from a single application, and then if there's been anybody that's looked at what that forage is. There's been some observational information, at least in my part of the foothills, that it may shift forage type significantly.
Yeah, I think Wendy Silver is going to show on the agenda for the afternoon is going to be talking about that, and so they've done a lot of work in that area, so they would probably be able to address that.
All right, very good, thank you.
Yeah.
All right.